How to handle a crisis in Christ. Next on The Balanced Word.
Wake up my soul. Wake up early in the day. Wake up my hand. And the instrument I play. Wake up my voice. Let the world hear me say, you are worshipped and exalted here today.
Hello and welcome to The Balanced Word. You can be sure even the most godly Christians will go through trials and even experience a full-blown crisis. But how will you handle it? Will you freak out as so many do? Or will you be a calm influence on those around you? Well, today we find the Apostle Paul in a crisis, and how he handles it is very instructive to us. Here's Pastor Dave Rolfe in Acts chapter 27 as he recalls a recent experience that sort of felt like a crisis.
Friday morning, we woke up to what felt like a crisis to me. I got out of bed early in the morning, going to take my shower, and I felt the floor felt kind of wet. Well, Ann got up a little later, turned on the lights, and there was water pooled in our master bathroom and in our master bedroom on the almost brand new wood floors that we have. So I'm like, I've had a slab leak everywhere I've ever lived. That's probably what it is, but it was just like, with everything else we're dealing with so much on the table, the last thing, but of course it really wasn't a crisis. I have insurance. I called my insurance guy, I called these people that come to dry out your house. I went in the garage and turned off the hot water so it wouldn't do any more damage. We mopped it up kind of. And again, we have insurance. Pastor Jerry, who was an insurance guy for a long time, I told him, man, this morning I had to, it was pretty cold in the morning and I had to take a cold shower because our hot water's turned off. And he goes, why are you taking a cold shower? You should have already been checked into the montage because your insurance company will pay for it. And I'm like, that's an insurance perspective compared to somebody who grew up in Stanton's perspective. But in reality, it'll be fine. I know that, been through it before, you get through it, but it just feels like a crisis. And I think that nowadays, almost everything feels like a crisis. When things don't go our way, there's so much that seems like it's out of our control that people actually turn things into a crisis that aren't really a crisis. A crisis, the word, it's the same root as the word cross. A crisis is a place where you get to a point and now it's critical because a decision needs to be made, and how you make that decision determines your future. And in general, when something's critical, it's actually what you do right now is life or death. And life has some of those crises, but we sometimes act like there are a lot more. And most people, if you haven't noticed, don't do well in a crisis. They don't make, decisions well and calmly when it feels like an emergency. But I really value people who do. There are certain people who you want them in a crisis because they are experts at crisis management. And sometimes they aren't people that you would expect, but my mom, for instance, was this way. I mean, she grew up as a little oaky, got married when she was 18 to a guy twice her age, and he has schizophrenia. Life was terrible. He's in and out of mental hospitals, and then he leaves. And she's raising 5 kids on $75 a week. And yet, she put herself through school. She became an X-ray technician, a radiation therapy technician. She was a first aid instructor. And part of why she could do all of that is if you had an emergency, my mom was falling apart half the time. One time she was in the hospital for a year because she was so suicidal. But, boom, if there's an emergency, my mom sprang into action. And I can't even count the number of times as kids, we're driving in the car, there's a big accident, my mom tells the kids to wait in the car, and she's over there saving someone's life. Over and over again, she'd come back to the car and act like it was nothing, blood all over her. She's like, yeah, they're going to make it. The ambulance driver said I saved the guy's life. That was just the way she was. And you look at that, there are certain people who are not so good in a crisis. I remember my son William, when he was younger, they were over at their grandma's house, my mom's house, and William swung a golf club, but the head came off the golf club, and the end of the shaft cut Danny's head open. And Danny's bleeding everywhere. Again, I'm thankful that my mom was there. If it had happened while Ann was watching them, it could have been a different outcome. But my mom gets the bleeding under control, gets the two boys in her car, and starts driving to the hospital. And the whole way to the hospital, she said, William was going, "Oh, Danny, you're going to bleed to death. Oh, it's so bad. I'm so sorry." He goes, "When you're going to get to the hospital, they're going to have to put a nail in your head to hold it shut. And oh, it's going to hurt. Danny, it's going to hurt so bad." William was only 17. No, he was like 5. But, that's the way some people react in a crisis. You're just not ready for this. You're not sure how to move forward. One of the best people in a crisis I ever saw was Pastor Chuck, too. He was one of these guys that when it really got serious, he could kind of snap into action. And the legendary story of the time when he took a group of people from Calvary to go to Hawaii, and on the plane, they got a lot of turbulence, and it was bouncing around, and they were wrestling with whether they should return or should they continue to go. And people on the plane were freaking out, even the people from Calvary. And then Chuck just starts singing really in that voice of his, "Heaven is a wonderful place filled with..." And then everybody starts singing it together. And that's who you want to be, the one who brings the calm to the situation. Because no one ever makes better decisions while they're freaking out. Now, as we've come to Acts chapter 27, we see the Apostle Paul in an amazing way, in a horrible crisis, when he is on a ship that's being torn apart, ripped apart, and it's going to sink, and there are 276 people on the boat, and Paul's the one guy on the ship who's a good crisis manager. He handled this situation in a way that you would hope, if you were ever in that situation, that you would handle it. And when we look at how Paul handled this crisis, it gives us some tips on how we might handle the various crises that we find ourselves in life. And to be able to know the difference between a crisis and just an ordinary kind of twist and turn of life itself. But Paul gives us a great picture here, and so if we want to learn about crisis management, Acts 27 is a great place to do it. So you can turn over there if you have a Bible with you. It starts out, Paul and a couple of his friends, Aristarchus and Luke, probably some others, they put him on a ship from Caesarea that was supposed to go along the coast until they could link up with a larger ship so that all these prisoners could be transported onto a big freighter or something and taken to Rome. So they end up going up to Sidon, and they land, and you see the relationship Paul already had with the centurion who was in charge. It says in verse 3 that Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him liberty to go to his friends and receive care. So they're there in Sidon, which is present-day Lebanon, up north of Syria, and the guy goes, "Oh, you know some people here? Go ahead and visit them, just be back for the ship." And so then they get on that ship, and they're sailing off, and they head out into the Mediterranean a little bit they found a ship from Egypt, from Alexandria, that they put them on. That ship takes off, and it heads out into the Mediterranean towards Crete. And we see that it landed in a place called Fairhaven, but you couldn't really dock there. They stayed there, but you couldn't stay there very long. So we come to verse 9, and let's look at this. Now, when much time had been spent there in Fairhaven, and sailing was now dangerous because the fast was already over, Paul advised them. The fast that it's talking about is probably Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement comes by our calendar usually late September, early October. So they had actually a proverb that warned you against sailing after the Day of Atonement, because now you're getting into the sketchy weather. And so Paul advised them in verse 10 and said, "Men, I perceive..." Now, he wasn't saying God has told me. He just said, I'm thinking, from what I know, from my experience, and he had certainly done his share of sailing, I perceived that this voyage is going to end with disaster and much loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also our lives. So he's like, guys, I'm deeply concerned about taking off from here and heading west in the Mediterranean this late in the year. Nevertheless, the centurion was more persuaded by the helmsman and the owner of the ship than by the things spoken by Paul. It was like, so you're some preacher and a prisoner, these guys are professionals, get out of the way, and we'll do what they think is best. Because the harbor wasn't suitable to winter in, they would have had to go somewhere else anyway. So the majority, in verse 12, advised to set sail if by any means they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, opening toward the southwest and northwest, and winter there. So they knew that if they could get around the edge of Crete, they could find a place where they could wait it out. And so it made sense. When the south wind blew softly, at that time there's a nice little breeze blowing, and so they thought they had obtained their desire, putting out to sea, and they sailed close by Crete. So far, so good. But in verse 14, not long after, a tempestuous headwind arose called Euroclydon. We don't really have any references specifically to Euroclydon in extra-biblical literature, but what we do know from reading various accounts in the Mediterranean, there were these certain winds that would come up. Normally when you're sailing, you know which way the wind is going, and you can sail into the wind, no problem. You can sail across the wind, no problem. You can sail with the wind behind you, no problem. But the tricky thing is when you have wind that's more like a hurricane, where it's shifting constantly, and that's what we think this storm was. So when the ship was caught and couldn't head into the wind, we let her drive. They're just like, okay, you're driving ship, and just went with it. Running under the shelter of an island called Clauda, we secured the skiff with difficulty. They finally pulled the little skiff up, and when they had taken it on board, they used cables to undergird the ship. And fearing lest they should run aground on the Syrtis sands, these sandbars that were there, they struck sail and so were driven. This thing with the cables, they call it frapping and sailing, where if your ship, you're concerned about the strength of it, and they have extra cables or ropes, they would hang it over the sides of the ship in front and then pull it back and then tighten it so it would be like an emergency adjustment to be able to hold the ship in one piece. All of these details, by the way, are fascinating when you see where they went, where they landed, how all this went down. Later on, we're going to see that when they sounded, they knew how it was 20 fathoms, and then it was 15 fathoms. Makes people believe, all these details makes people think that Luke, who was a researcher and historian, probably got a hold of the ship's log. And that's why he knew all of the information, including how many people are on board and where all of these things happened. So Luke ended up having those records. It's very meticulous. And so they're trying to hold the ship together. But long after, it starts getting worse. Finally, they tighten the ship, and then verse 19, we threw the ship's tackle overboard, all the extra stuff that they hadn't used to hold it together, plus they needed the 4 anchors that they had, in order to land it, but they started dumping extra weight, lightening the ship. Now, when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest beat on us, all hope that we would be saved was finally given up. Here's a crisis. Luke's talking, and even he said, I figured we were dead. I thought this is over. Everyone, 275 of the 276 people on the boat thought, we're going to die. This is it. There's no way out of this. And so as they're negotiating that, all hope was given away. After long abstinence in verse 21, just hanging in there, and they hadn't eaten, Paul stood up in the midst of them and said, men, you should have listened to me. Thanks. Sometimes that's what a crisis manager does. Like, now do you believe me? And not have sailed from Crete and incurred this disaster and loss. So really what he's doing is establishing himself as the leader. I called this one. And now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. I love that. He's like, don't worry, none of you are going to die. We're going to lose the ship, but you're all going to survive. For there stood by me this night, verse 23, an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve. And this angel said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must be brought before Caesar, and indeed, God has granted you all those who sail with you. So he goes, an angel came and told me, it's going to be fine. I'm going to Rome, and you guys, because you're with me, you're going to be fine too. And it's nice to hear somebody with some optimism at a time when everyone else is freaking out. But he says in verse 25, therefore take heart, men, for I believe God that it will be just as it was told me. However, we do need to run aground on a particular island. Now, when the 14th night had come, as we were driven up and down in the Adriatic Sea, about midnight, the sailors sensed that they were getting near land. The jury's still out on Paul's, word from the Lord. They took soundings and checked the depth, and it was 20 fathoms, which would be like 40 yards, 120 feet. A fathom is between, when you stretch your arms out from the tip of one finger to the tip of the other finger, it's about 2 yards. So they said, okay, we're 20 fathoms deep. And, so they're thinking, we're getting closer to land. Maybe this guy knows what he's talking about. But they took soundings again, and it was only 15 fathoms. So they're like, we're getting close to land. That could be good or bad, because now we're getting in danger of, if there is a sandbar or something, we could get stuck and can't go any further. Verse 29, then fearing lest we should run aground on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. They're like, oh, God that talked to Paul, if you're listening, we could use some help here. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship, when they had let down the skiff into the sea under pretense of putting out anchors from the prow, the sailors were like, we're close enough to land. I think we can make it in the little lifeboat. And so they were pretending like they were putting down the anchor, but really they were putting down the boat, because they're like, we're not going to die with these people. So Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. In other words, it's going to take all of us. Soldiers, you know how to fight. Centurion, you know how to direct soldiers, but none of us are sailors. So if these guys leave, we're probably all dead. And we're really hoping to not be all dead. And so the centurion now listened to him. The soldiers cut away the ropes of the skiff and let it fall off. So the sailors were like, oh, well, I guess we're in it with you. And day was about to dawn. And look at this in verse 33. Paul implored them all to take food and said, today is the 14th day you've waited and continued without food, and you've eaten nothing. Therefore, I urge you to take nourishment, for this is for your survival, since not a hair will fall from the head of any of you. And so Paul said, I know this sounds crazy right now, but you guys need to eat, because you're going to need the strength that food will give you. Now, they had plenty of food. It was a ship going from Egypt to Rome full of wheat. So they had plenty of grain on board, probably other food as well. But he's like, come on, man. You guys are going to need every bit of strength that you can get when this all comes down, and when our ship is falling apart. If we're going to get to shore, it's going to be because we're all healthy. And so after he said that in verse 35, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. He set the example by eating first. Some people see in this verse a reference to that he served communion, because it talks about Jesus, and we celebrate communion today on the first Sunday of the month. But Jesus took the bread and broke it and gave it to his disciples, and he ate. But that was just what they did when they ate, so it may not be a reference to communion necessarily. But then, look at verse 36. They were all encouraged and took food themselves. How could the attitude of one man make everyone else feel encouraged? Well, that's what you want in a crisis. Somebody who has the ability to tell you, look, you're going to need to eat in order to get through this crisis. Maybe you've gone through things in your life that felt like it was life and death, or maybe you lost someone that you love. The last thing you feel like is eating. But one of the first things we tell people who are in crisis is you need to make sure that you eat because you need that strength. One of the best things you can do as a friend is take somebody to get something to eat because it helps your body to be able to process, and you're going to think much more rationally, and you can move better if you've had something to eat. And so because they hadn't eaten anything, he got them to eat, and they felt encouraged. And in all, we were 275 persons on the ship. So when they had eaten enough, everyone was full, they lightened the ship and threw out the wheat into the sea. They go, this is getting serious now. We're either going to be dead or saved before we need another meal. So let's just dump all this wheat. It's not going to do anyone any good in a sunken ship. And so they did that, and when it was day, they didn't recognize the land, but they saw a bay with a beach onto which they planned to run the ship if possible, and they let go the anchors and left them in the sea, loosened the rudder ropes, and they hoisted the mainsail to the wind and made for shore. Again, so much meticulous detail. We don't know of Luke being an expert on sailing, but certainly in the ship's logs, they would keep all of these kind of detailed records, and he was a researcher.
You're listening to The Balanced Word with Pastor Dave Rolfe and a part of a series in Acts called Fresh Church. Hear it again online at thebalancedword.com. You can also call and request a CD at 949-362-7475. Again, we're online at thebalancedword.com, and the number is 949-362-7475. We also offer The Balanced Word by podcast. Listen to Pastor Dave on Apple Podcasts. You can find us by searching for Pacific Hills Calvary Chapel. And have you had a chance to see Pastor Dave's 1-minute messages on Instagram and Facebook? It's a great way to start the day with hope and encouragement, straight from the Scriptures. Search for CC Pacific Hills, or you can sign up to have them delivered to you when you visit thebalancedword.com. Today, we're also pleased to offer you Pastor Dave's series, Basic Theology. In it, he discusses the inerrancy of Scripture, the problem of evil, eschatology, the Holy Spirit, and more. We'll send you all 16 messages on a USB thumb drive. It's available right now for your gift of $20 or more to The Balanced Word. Just call 949-362-7475 or request this special offer at thebalancedword.com. We'd also like to pray for you. Contact us today through the website at thebalancedword.com and let us know how we can pray for you. Join us for a service at Pacific Hills Calvary Chapel in person or online. Our Sunday morning services begin at 8, 9:45, and 11:30 Pacific Time. Find more details and watch the live stream at ccpacifichills.org or watch us through Roku. Search for Pacific Hills Calvary Chapel on your Roku TV. Let's get back to our story. Listen to this.
But striking a place where two seas met, that is a peninsula with water on either side, they ran the ship aground, and the prow stuck fast and remained immovable, but the stern was being broken up by the violence of the waves. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, because they're like, if these guys escape, it's our necks. So the Roman soldiers felt pretty competent once they were this close to land, because every Roman soldier was taught how to swim. It was a part of their training. So they thought, we'll escape, but man, if we just kill these prisoners, it'll look like they were lost in the shipwreck, and we'll have our rear ends covered. But so that was their thought. They didn't want any of them swimming away. But the centurion, wanting to save Paul, he's like, no, if you kill the prisoners, you're going to kill Paul. He's the reason we're still alive. So he kept them from their purpose and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land, which would primarily be the Roman soldiers. It wasn't a common thing for people to know how to swim, but Roman soldiers all did. So he goes, instead of killing the prisoners, I got this. You guys, every man for himself, swim for shore. And the rest, some on boards. Again, this is one of the first references to surfing in the Bible. and some on parts of the ship, whatever they could find that would float. And so it was that they all escaped safely to the land. So amazing that in the middle of this crisis, somehow, partly because of the influence of Paul and his faith, everyone, 276 people, survived a catastrophic shipwreck. That was just unheard of.
Next time on The Balanced Word, Pastor Dave Rolfe will share a few helpful principles for crisis management. This program is brought to you each day by Pacific Hills Calvary Chapel.
Wake up my soul. Wake up early in the day. Wake up my hands. And the instrument I play. Wake up my voice.